Hello, Internet. This time I have been asked by my audience, or at least some in my audience, to talk more about Vikings. So I will push the shipwreck video I had planned for next week, and instead I will talk to you today about the Jomsvikings. The Jomsvikings was probably the most famous, shall we call them, private Scandinavian Viking armies in the great years of 950 to about 1000. From their castle in Jomsborg, they were harrying all of the Baltic regions and plundering all they came across. I will go basically around the saga, telling that story, plus what we know historically, as well as their decline and end, which the saga itself doesn't cover. And trust me, there will be enough blood and betrayal and cut off limbs for everyone. So yeah, enjoy. According to the sagas, the Jomsvikings had their beginning in the murder of a powerful Jarl by King Harald Bluetooth of Denmark. A Jarl was sort of the catch-all title for Scandinavian nobility if you weren't powerful enough to be a king. There were sort of other kind of noblemen, but a Jarl was directly under the king, a sort of pre-feudal nobility that had sworn direct allegiance to the king while maintaining his own government of his own areas. It is basically referable to the British Earl, which is where that particular name stems from. Actually, Earl is basically just a Nordic Jarl and presumably comes from a time where the Northmen controlled most of England. However, Harald Bluetooth killed this Earl, and the Earl's brother, or Jarl's brother, instead of seeking immediate vengeance because he couldn't take on his king, instead followed the advice of his sister and married a famous and clever noble woman to sire a very powerful son who could, take over the duty, because that's what you do when your brother is being murdered by the king. When that son, called Palnatoke, came to age, they then sent him to the king's court. For most of a while, Palnatoke actually served King Harald fairly well, even helping him getting rid of the king's ambitious nephew, Gold Harald. But eventually he became a foe of the king, because, that's how it was meant to be, and was forced to leave the king's domain with some of his followers. They went to Wenden, in what is today modern-day Poland, and from the Wendish king they were allowed to found and build the castle of Jomsborg, probably near where modern-day Volyn is placed. They then gathered to them all sorts of brave men, like the mighty Styrbjörn the Strong, a Swedish prince who eventually took over the rule of the group as the mightiest amongst them. The Jomsvikings plundered all over the Baltic, fighting with great pleasure Harald of Denmark, and particularly his steward over Norway, Hakon Jarl. Jarl again being the title that Hakon had because he ruled Norway in the name of Harald. Now, this is from the saga. In the Gesta Danorum, the tale of the Danish people by Saxo Grammaticus, the Jomsvikings were actually Harald's allies and basically his personal army group in the Wendish area, but here we're following the sagas where they are enemies. This is a bit, contradictory, but whether to trust the sagas or Saxo is always a big issue. Anyway, Palnatoke, after Styrbjörn had taken over rule of the Jomsvikings, decided to go back and rekindle his friendship with Harald. He did, and was allowed to rule his family's great holdings after his father's was dead, as well as being tutor to Harald's son Sven. Harald and Sven, however, did not get along. There are various reasons for that. Harald was a committed Christian. Sven was still somewhat heathen despite being baptized on his father's command. And Harald was completely uncertain if he was actually his or the boy's father, as Sven was son of one of his mistresses, and eventually Harold came to the conclusion that Sven probably wasn't his son and had become a rival to the throne. So the hostility between father and son once again caused the friendship between King Harold and Palnatoke to break down, and Harold decided to get rid of his powerful subject. So, at one Christmas evening, where Palnatoke was bragging about his great prowess as an archer, Harold pulled a Wilhelm Tell on him, except for 500 years earlier, by making him shoot an apple off the head of Palnatoke's son. Palnatoke brought out 2 arrows. He took the first and shot the apple off the head of his son. And of course, Harold had told Palnatoke that the son would be put to death if he didn't hit the apple. So Harold then asked, "What would you have done with the second arrow if you missed with the first?" "Well, my liege king, if the first arrow had missed, the second arrow would have hit you." That didn't really improve matters between the two men, and eventually later, during a travel to Norway, Harold decided to try to get rid of Palnatoke by, when he again bragged about his skiing prowess, having him ski down one of the steepest mountains in the Norwegian area. Palnatoke somehow managed to get down to the coast alive and then fled back to the Jomsvikings because he realized where things were going. At this time, Styrbjörn was trying to attack Sweden at the cost of many Jomsvikings' lives when they lost their attack in a great battle at Uppsala against the Swedish king Erik the Victorious. This, of course, weakened the Jomsvikings, but also ensured that Palnatoke once more took rulership over Jomsborg and the particular group that remained in the Wendish areas and hadn't followed Styrbjörn to Sweden. Now Sven, Harold's bastard son and Palnatoke's former ward, had become a great Viking in his own, plundering all over the region, and his father got even more jealous of him. However, with the Jomsvikings decimated, he felt secure that Sven would lack allies and started to act arrogant towards his son, and eventually got into a civil war with him, won some early skirmishes and forced Sven to flee south. Harold followed with his fleet and had his son blocked in a shallow bay on the coast of modern Germany and was ready to finish him off. However, Palnatoke in Jomsborg had gotten reinforcement by the powerful Viking brothers Strut-Harald and Thorkild the Tall, and with their combined forces he sailed to aid Sven and in an evening attack broke Harold's blockade. Harold then went ashore, intending to regroup and then defeat his united foes in a land and sea battle the next day, but Palnatoke crept ashore and, as the king was taking a shit, shot him through his arse with an arrow that then came out of his mouth. Sven thus became king and, together with the Jomsvikings, made a great feast where they all got roaring drunk and made some rather mean promises. Sven made the somewhat perhaps rash promise to conquer all of England and add it to his realm, while the Jomsvikings promised to remove Håkon Jarl from the rule of Norway, so Sven didn't have to deal with one of his father's more powerful servant as ruler of a significant part of his realm. Well, the Jomsvikings gathered their fleet. Palnatoke, who had become a somewhat elderly man, stayed back in Jomsborg, but the Jomsviking Bue the Fat and his brother Visete, plus their nephew Vagn Åkesson, led the fleet. They went to Norway, but unfortunately Håkon summoned his heathen deity Thorgerd, and a massive snowstorm went into the faces of the Jomsvikings, so Håkon's fleet could win the mighty battle. Bue fought on until both his hands were chopped off by axe blows. Then he stuck the bleeding stump in under 2 heavy treasure chests and jumped into the ocean in order not to be taken by his foes, while shouting, "The battle is lost! Overboard all men of Bue!" Eventually, all the Jomsvikings were killed except for 30 men who were caught, amongst them the last leader, Vagn Ågesson. The Norwegians cut down a tree and placed the prisoners on the trunk, tying them together at their feet, and under the orders of Erik Jarl, Hakon's son, a certain Thorkild Leira began to chop the heads off the prisoners one by one. One of the Jomsvikings speculated about life in the next world and said, "If I feel anything once my head has been chopped off, I will take this stick that I hold in my hand and push it into the ground." His head was chopped off, but the stick just went out of the hand of the gentleman. The next one who was supposed to have his head chopped off was a young man with very long and very beautiful hair. And he then asked that, okay, it's one thing to have my head chopped off, but I really don't want my hair ruined. So he asked one of the Norwegians if he could hold the hair while Thorkild chopped off his head. And they felt that was okay, so the Norwegian held his hair. Now, when Thorkild brought down the axe, the young man pulled back on his head very powerfully, so the axe instead went through the hands of the Norwegian. This was, of course, very fair, as the young man was Sigurd, the son of Bue, who had, well, as I mentioned earlier, lost his hands in the same way in the battle. The Norwegians was fairly impressed with the young man's cleverness and asked if he would accept pardon and instead begin to serve Hakon Jarl and his son, and the young man eventually accepted. Thorkild Leira, the executioner, did not particularly like this development. He had a personal grudge for Vagn Ågesson from earlier hostilities, and he knew that during the now so famous party with Sven and the Jomsvikings, Ågesson's particular promise had been to actually murder Thorkild Leira and rape his daughter, just to make sure everyone knew that Vagn really didn't like him. And now it seemed like Erik Jarl had decided to pardon at least some of the Jomsvikings and take them into his service. So he ran at Vagn with the axes and shouted, "You can stop laughing, Vagn! You will definitely not survive." One of the other Vikings, however, threw himself ahead of or into the feet of Thorkild, so Thorkild fell and the axe flew out of his hands. Vagn caught it and shouted, "Not yet are all Jomsvikings dead," and chopped down into Thorkild, so he died. Whether or not he then later raped the daughter is actually not told in the saga, but one can assume. Erik Jarl was heavily impressed and asked, "Do you want pardon as well, Vagn?" "Yes, if we all get it." And so they did. That was the last 12 Jomsvikings surviving the raid on Norway. And the fact that they went into the service directly of Erik Jarl rather than his father Hakon also ensured their survival a few years later when Hakon was overthrown. With this ends the saga of the Jomsvikings. According to the Gesta Danorum, the story is somewhat different. In Saxo, the Jomsvikings was basically King Harald's personal army in the Wendish territories, and Palnatoke and him, in fact, spent most of their years as friends, and only at the very end did they become hostile to each other, and Palnatoke was never ruler of Jomsborg. In fact, during the civil war between Sven and Harald, the Jomsvikings fought on Harald's side, and it was actually Sven who chased Harald down there, and it was the Jomsvikings who helped Harald, capture Sven in a blockade around Germany, though Palnatoke still shot the arrow through Harald's ass. After that, the Jomsvikings caught Sven, but instead of killing him, since, well, Harold was dead after all, there was no real point in it, they settled for ransoming him off, and then to celebrate their payment of the massive ransom, they then held the great party where Sven promised to conquer England and the Jomsvikings promised to harry Håkon Jarl with fire and sword. However, I do think the saga is more interesting, even if Saxo is probably closer to the truth. After the Battle of Hjörungavágr, where the Jomsvikings were stopped in Norway, the remaining Jomsvikings in Jomsborg remained allies of Sven. We are now outside the sagas and back in pure history. In Norway, the family of Håkon Jarl was finally removed in Norway by a king called Olav Tryggvason, who returned from England Christian and chased Håkon, who had made himself rather unpopular, out of Norway and made himself king. However, the Jomsvikings then made a plan with Sven, King Sven of Denmark, to get Norway back on Danish hands. The Jomsvikings under Sigvald pretended to join with Olav, being angry that Håkon's son Erik was now with Sven in Denmark, having accepted Sven's suzerainty after the hostility of their fathers. And together with Olav, the Jomsvikings under Sigvald then plundered the coasts of Sweden and the Baltic countries. On their way back towards Norway, the raiding fleet of Olav was then waylaid by the massive Danish war fleet under King Sven, reinforced with Erik Jarl and his forces, and by ships from King Olaf of Sweden, who were pissed that the Norwegian king had raided his particular areas. Even so, Olaf's fleet fought valiantly when the Jomsvikings suddenly switched side to Sven, as was, of course, planned all along, which was the whole point of this thing. Olav, however, still felt he had one triumph left. In his employ on his own ship, he had an incredibly important archer called Einar Tambeskjelver, who basically means Einar shaking in their boots over how hard he can hit. It's not completely true, but it's basically what it means. And he had Einar try to shoot at King Sven because, if Sven would die, then the alliance might be able to fall apart and Olav may be able to escape. Einar shot at him but was not quite able to kill Sven, so Sven had one of his own archers shoot back at Einar, and that archer's arrow actually broke Einar's bow. Olav turned to him and said, "What did I hear break?" And Einar shook his head and said, "The rule of Norway out of your hand, my king." So, yeah, he apparently had fairly high opinions about himself. Anyway, the battle went against Olav, of course, and eventually only his own personal longship, the Long Worm, was left, and the Norwegians under Erik Jarl was basically pressing it hard. So eventually Olav did what Boo had done some years earlier during Hjörungavágr, and jumped into the sea to commit suicide in order to not be taken by his enemies. Thus, Norway passed back under Danish rule, and Erik Jarl, with his Jomsviking followers, became the steward of Norway under King Sven, as his father Håkon had been under King Harold some years earlier. For another 14 years after this, the Jomsvikings continued their traditional life of plundering in the eastern Baltic regions. Then Thorkild the Tall and a large number joined Sven, because he had finally decided that he needed to keep his promise. So he gathered the full Danish war fleet and invaded England to conquer every bit of the British lands. He plundered up and down the British territories, while the British king shot himself in London. Sometime during the campaign, Thorkild changed side to the British, but apparently it didn't really matter, because Sven did conquer all of Britain, force the British noblemen to swear him allegiance, and the English king went into exile in France, and Sven brought England into the Great Northern Empire. He then died soon after, and eventually his son Knut, the famous Canute the Great, ruled the Great Northern Empire that stretched basically from the farthest reaches of the Baltic until parts of Ireland. The Jomsvikings themselves went into a powerful decline around this time, whether it be because the Christianity was taking more hold in the Nordic and the old Viking way of life was basically about to, well, die out, or if they were lacking powerful leaders, or if they had been more or less discredited by Thorkild the Tall's constant changing of sides during Sven's English campaigns. The next, shall we say, the next about 30 years saw them decline and become fairly irrelevant until in 1043, Magnus the Strong, king of Norway and Denmark, he was actually king of Norway and brought Denmark into his rule, unlike Sven, who did it the other way around, brought his fleet to Jomsborg, destroyed the castle, killed all the Jomsvikings, and ended their tale for good. Thus ends the Jomsvikings' tales and stories. So much for the sagas and the Gesta Danorum, which is... It is a history book, but it was written in the medieval style, so it doesn't really conform to modern day standards of historical accuracy, though, of course, having been written only about 100 years after the events here and with access to the royal archives of the time, I would assume that Saxo was actually fairly accurate when it comes to the Jomsviking story, so probably his version of it is more true than the sagas, but of course the sagas are in and of itself more interesting. What do we actually know historically about the Jomsvikings? Well, we know they actually existed. There are several rune stones attesting directly to their groups, amongst others in Sweden, that regards to the defeat of Styrbjörn during the invasion of Sweden. We know they were staunchly devoted to the old gods, heavily heathen, or heathen if you, of course, choose Christianity as the go-to religion that needed to be in control. Probably devoted specifically to Tyr or to Odin as war gods of their particular society. We know that only brave men between the ages of 18 and 50 could be allowed to join after committing a great feat of strength. Only Vagn Åkesson, that I mentioned earlier, joined earlier when he, at the age of 12, beat his uncle Sigvald in a duel man-to-man to gain entrance. That was a very powerful deed. It is known they allowed no women inside the fortress and would allow no women to be taken captives on their raids, though if this meant that they were celibate is more of a doubt. They might have intermarried with Wendish women living outside the fortress walls, and of course Vagn's promise to rape Thorkild Lyra's daughter means that they were not at least unknown with the concept of what men and women did with each other or to each other. Tales say that the fleet varied between about 30 ships at its smallest to around 300 at its highest. 300 seems unlikely to me if we are talking about the large Viking longships. That matches basically the full sea mobilization of the Danish kingdom at its height under Sven and Knut, and that was at the time by far the strongest and most powerful navy in the world, and demanding full cooperation of all free men of the northern realms. So that a private Viking army could field the same kind of fleet seems fairly unlikely to me. More probably, the Jomsvikings consisted of various bands of roaming marauders uniting under the lord of the fortress when they were at home, or of course if they came under outside threat. The town itself seemed to have been a market town for the Wendish areas, and it is fairly doubtful if the Joms chieftains actually ruled the area or simply held the castle, like I said, as probably a sort of outpost for the Danish interests in the area. Well, that was the story of the Jomsvikings, the largest private Viking enterprise with any real staying power, lasting for about almost 60 years, which was fairly unusual at the time, where most Viking raids was basically banding together under one powerful chieftain, going on a massive plundering raid, and then separating back to one's various homes. But again, the Jomsvikings was, as I said, more like a fraternal order of warriors than a actual sort of army. So to that degree, it could have explained why that happened. It was the height of the Viking sort of culture in many ways, but at the same time, it was also its last gasp of the old northern heathen way of life before Christianity and southern European cultural mores entered from southern Europe and destroyed that particular Viking kind of existence. Since it's documented outside the sagas, like I said, we can basically assume it's true, which is very rare for many Viking stories. So at least it's definitely interesting history, and I would encourage all to read both the sagas and the Gesta Danorum if you can find it. Next time we move forward in time about 100 years and into England and learn how a single shipwreck caused a 30 years civil war. Until then, I have been the Sage, and I wish you all a very happy day.